Today is really a celebration of a recently published new book, a collaborative project that has recently been published on feminism and sovereign debt, that's been edited by Juan Pablo Bohoslavsky and Mariana Rulli, produced with the generous support of the Bretton Woods Project and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. I'm Christina Lascaridis. I'm a lecturer here in the department, contributed to this collaborative project and convener of the seminar series here. So I'll be facilitating today's event. I'll just start with a tiny bit of housekeeping. We started this seminar series precisely to bring together academics to exchange with practitioners, activists, members of the public, people in trade unions and civil society. Since launching in 2020, we've covered a whole range of things from cost of living crisis, health crisis, the care economy, inequality, climate change. I'll put in the chat just now where you can find more information about future and past events, but also this event today is being recorded, and that's where you'll be able to find the repository of today's event, together with some additional resources like links to the book and other things that will be coming up in relation to this event here. So that's where you can keep track of what we're doing. With us today, we have an exceptional lineup of speakers, and this is just an opportunity to thank you all for your time to be here to present this collaborative work. Diane Elson, Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Essex, has a lifelong experience of pioneering work in gender equality and economic policy, having been advisor to numerous UN agencies and the former chair of the UK Women's Budget Group. Having written the prologue for the book, we are delighted that Diane will be introducing the topic today more fully. Juan Pablo Bohoslavsky is co-editor and mastermind behind the volume, together with Mariana Rulli. He holds a PhD in law and is currently senior researcher at Argentina's National Scientific and Technical Research Council. Most importantly, his role as former independent expert on the impact of foreign debt on human rights at the OHCHR, the Office of the United Nations High Commission of Human Rights, pioneered a number of very important pieces of work. Dorothy Estrada-Tanck is Professor of Public International Law at the University of Murcia, has an extensive academic and professional experience across a number of institutions, UN, state, NGO and academic. She's currently the chair of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, which is the body that's mandated to escalate the efforts to eliminate all forms of discrimination. And we're very happy you've joined us today. Mariana Zucker-Marques is postdoctoral research fellow at SOAS, University of London, and researcher as part of the Debt Relief for a Green and Inclusive Recovery Project. And with Penelope Hawkins from UNCTAD, who wasn't able to join us today, is also contributing to this book and our event. Last but not least, Patricia Miranda is Global Advocacy Director at the Latin American Network for Economic and Social Justice, LatinDad, has an extensive experience in debt and issues of external financing, how they cross-cut with gender and climate, with a long experience of advocacy processes at the UN and the IFI. So we're delighted that you have all been able to join us today. We have about 12 minutes for each speaker, followed by a Q&A that I will be facilitating. So without further ado, I'm handing over to Diane. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. I'm delighted to be joining this seminar and to meet face to face some of the people that I've known on the page as I read through the manuscript of this book and wrote a foreword to it. So this path-breaking book challenges conventional approaches to government indebtedness by proposing that government debt is a feminist issue. It focuses in particular on debt-distressed low and middle-income countries, especially in Latin America, providing new conceptual and empirical analysis and suggestions for alternative, more gender-equitable policies relating to sovereign debt. It's particularly original in counterposing the rights of international creditors to the human rights of people living in debt-distressed countries, and arguing that human rights should take precedence. Of course, lending and borrowing are everyday vital activities for governments, businesses, and people. And in the right circumstances, lending and borrowing can contribute to enhanced well-being, improved livelihoods, and accumulation of valuable community assets, especially if organized through systems that have a high degree of mutuality, such as credit unions. However, lending and borrowing are more often marked by very unequal power. In financial markets, relations between creditors and debtors are not symmetrical. The laws that govern these activities are marked by a creditor bias, privileging the rights of creditors over those of debtors. An extreme form of creditor bias can be seen in the devastating debt trap in which almost all governments of low and middle income countries now find themselves. They're held responsible for state debt, whether or not they themselves accumulated this debt, and they're facing increasingly unfavorable conditions in the international economy, relating in particular to interest rates, exchange rates, and demand for their exports, over which they have no control. It has now become impossible to service this debt, on which interest has to be paid to foreign creditors in foreign currencies. Businesses faced with similar conditions can repudiate their debts through applying for bankruptcy, but no such option is open to governments. There's no regular legal mechanism for unwinding sovereign debt. So governments must apply for debt relief on a case-by-case basis, especially to the IMF, which conducts a so-called debt sustainability analysis and invariably concludes that austerity measures are required to make the debt sustainable. But as this thought-provoking book demonstrates, measures that supposedly make government debt sustainable are making life unsustainable, with deepening poverty, worsening health, and additional burdens on poor women. This book illustrates how this bias system of lending and borrowing is a gendered system, both in terms of the way that women and men are positioned in the financial system and the way that the financial system interacts with the process of social reproduction, in which women have most of the responsibility for unpaid care work. Men dominate most of the key financial decision-making positions in businesses, banks, and regulatory institutions, governments, and international financial institutions, and women are disproportionately among those adversely affected by austerity measures. However, as contributors to this book show, promoting more women to leadership positions in the financial system will not solve the problem, because the data and the models that are used to analyze debt and debt sustainability exclude the unpaid care economy that's vital for social reproduction. Imposing government debt as a feminist issue, this book highlights issues that are obscured in conventional economic analysis, including the way that violence, actual or threatened, and dispossession are utilized to discipline debtors. And it illuminates the ways that attempts to reduce government debt through austerity measures lead to increases in household debt, especially for the poorest women. It argues that non-financial debt should be recognized as well as financial debts, and that finance capital is indebted to women and to nature for unpaid services that underpin its activities. This book reverses the morality tale that's often told about debt. Instead of seeing debtors as uniquely irresponsible, it reveals the irresponsibility of creditors in creating a flawed international financial system that generates booms and busts in liquidity. And the risks in this system are not pooled and shared, but are downloaded from the dealing rooms of financial markets to the kitchens of the poor. The book rightly pays a lot of attention to the IMF as the linchpin of this system. And it's worth, I think, highlighting, as the book shows, that approval from the IMF is conditional for countries on countries implementing austerity programs. It's worth highlighting that these IMF conditions do not, in fact, lead to debt sustainability because they dampen economic growth. But the IMF analysis does not reveal this because it uses models that build in over-optimistic growth projections. Even on its own terms, IMF debt sustainability analysis is not fit for purpose. As the contributors to this book argue, the discovery by the IMF that, quote, gender equality is a macro-critical issue and the elaboration of an IMF gender strategy has done nothing to address the ways in which the operations of the IMF itself add to gender inequality. I think what is needed is a fundamental reform of the international financial system. Christina, in her contribution to the book, although she's not going to be presenting that today, takes up this issue of the need to reform the international financial system. The adoption of a human rights approach to the issue of sovereign debt, including conducting human rights impact assessments of debt-related policies, could play an important role in providing a moral justification for debt restructuring and debt cancellation, both within countries and in intergovernmental fora. This moral justification asserts that the rights of creditors should be subordinate to human rights obligations and would put the fulfillment of women's rights at the centre of the governance of systems of borrowing and lending, both nationally and internationally. To put this into practice requires changes in law, both nationally and internationally, and in the operation of the international financial system. And contributors to this book make important proposals for concrete reforms and also emphasize the importance of cooperation between countries in the global south to bring about change, and the participation of women's organizations that adopt a transformative approach to gender equality to design and monitor reforms to ensure that the benefits are distributed in ways that reduce gender inequality. The principles of mutuality and reciprocity between creditors and debtors need to be rediscovered and put at the heart of reforms. The proposals originally put forward by Keynes at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 did rest on such principles in the shape of an international clearing union organized along cooperative lines. But in the system that was actually set up, these principles were only very partially accepted and subsequently further sidelined as the US dollar and private finance came to dominate the system. Provisions for the IMF to provide automatic bridging loans to assist member countries that were in difficulties were not accepted, and conditionality came to dominate. There are signs of some new thinking among some governments, such as the 2022 Bridgetown Initiative by the government of Barbados, calling for reform of the global financial architecture, urging we must act now. We cannot be good at rescuing banks, but bad at saving countries. And this initiative has been backed by the UN Secretary General and is being widely discussed. This is a step forward, but there's still much to be done. And if progress is made on reforming the international financial system, the challenge will still remain of ensuring that freeing governments from debt distress will be translated into improvements in well-being and reductions in inequality. And here feminist movements have a vital role to play. I think this innovative book shows the benefits of a feminist approach to the sovereign debt crisis because it goes well beyond a concern with increasing economic growth to pose as a key test, what will reforms mean for poor women? Will their debt distress be ended? Will their human rights be fulfilled? I'm looking forward to the contributors to the book that we have with us today, presenting to you in more detail the great analysis and proposals that they've got in the book. And I just want to congratulate Juan Pablo and his fellow editor and all the contributors to the book. I hope we'll have a very stimulating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. That's really started us off well. And we'll invite Juan Pablo to the floor.
Great. Can you hear me well? Good. So many thanks, Christina. Good morning from here, from Argentina. Good afternoon for you. Thanks a lot for your efforts to organize this panel and for inviting me today. It is an honor to be part of this discussion with such respected and hard-working colleagues. On the book we are presenting and discussing today, it is a collective project in its broadest sense. A number of experts from academia, civil society, international organizations, and also national governments propose an interdisciplinary dialogue to show how debt-related economic policies are widening gender inequalities, and also argues for a systematic feminist approach to debt issues. In other words, this volume proposes to broaden and strengthen a feminist approach to the challenges posed by sovereign over-indebtedness of low and middle-income countries, as Diane explained, and also debt-related androcentric economic policies to women's rights. So contributors address questions regarding sovereign debt and gender economic violence, development, climate change, legal standards, UN conferences, international financial institutions, mainly IMF and World Bank, and the androcentric policies, the right to care and the right to education, private debt, budget and debt sustainability analysis with a gender perspective, social progress indicators, feminist reforms of international financial architecture, the so-called gender bonds, and also the institutionalization of gender approach in the public debt field. In my presentation today, I want to contribute to this conversation by providing a few ideas to strengthen our analytical framework to better understand the complex links between debt vulnerabilities, orthodox economic policies, and women's rights in order to somehow collectively think of effective policy recommendations. So on the one hand, recognizing that the matrix of gender relations is a variable that permeates all economic activities, obviously the contractual conditions and also the volume of public debt, as well as the economic policies that are often implemented in order to ensure the full repayment of the debt, their links could never be neutral from a gender-based perspective. Therefore, due to the historical and persistent conditions of gender inequalities in the world, over-indebtedness, the criteria we use to assess debt sustainability and the adjustment policies frequently implemented to ensure the full repayment of debt affect women's human rights in all their diversity in a differential way. Even before the beginning of the COVID pandemic, a large number of countries had already high levels of sovereign debts, with debt services that took the lion's share and in consequence, the possibility to ensure a proper expenditure financing to satisfy basic social needs. Indeed, towards the end of 2022, 60% of low-income countries and 30% of emerging economies were experiencing or close to experience situation of debt and sustainability, with a very likely global crisis of debt. And in accordance with IMF projections, in 2024, half of low-income and middle-income countries will allocate fewer resources to the health budget than the ones allocated on average during the decade between 2010 and 20. And one of the reasons is the significant increase of the amounts allocated to repay the external debt. Besides, it is worth mentioning that this higher level of debt has not actually benefited women. If we take debt to support growth or finance infrastructure as an example, the growth per se does not ensure a higher or better participation of women in the labor market, and the infrastructure does not usually consider the care economy. International financial institutions led by the IMF and the World Bank have been suggesting and requiring and pushing for, even during the pandemic, the need to implement orthodox economic measures. In other words, programs of structural adjustments. And they did it. As of this year, 2023, 85% of the world population is surviving under austerity measures, which will continue at least until 2025. So these programs have the face of a woman, as they often disproportionately affect this population group, worsening pre-existing gender inequalities. The largest participation of private capitals in public services, driven both by the IMF and in particular by the World Bank before, during, and after the pandemic, by placing profit as an omnipotent factor, is another policy that disproportionately affects women. The negative consequences for women's rights can be immediately noted in ways that are more or less obvious, and their effects can actually last for decades. And this is also part of the so-called intergenerational implications of sovereign debt. Now, I want to recall that this financial institution, the IMF, launched the self-proclaimed gender strategy in July 2024. And as it was suggested in a letter that a number of mandate holders of the UN special procedures submitted to the IMF in 2022, as well as in a number of studies carried out by academics and civil society organizations. This so-called IMF gender strategy tries to be indeed a justification of orthodox policies. Under this strategy, women's interests are relevant. They are so-called macro-critical, in the words of the IMF, and are worth of being promoted as long as they improve the fiscal situation of the debtor states and promote GDP growth, even at the expense of worsening the rights of women, as it is the case when women are incorporated into the labor market with precarious or informal conditions. If someone still has some doubts about the instrumental nature of the IMF gender strategy, well, you have to know that in 2017, the IMF posted an article on its website written by, of course, male economists, where they explain why it was worth investing on health of women in Rwanda. And let me quote: "Healthy women will probably work outside their houses. They will have more stamina and energy for physical jobs, and they will work more hours." This step taken by the IMF to create the so-called gender strategy came, I think, to confirm a growing idea in industrialized countries about the importance of gender equality in terms of economic efficiency and good governance, which strengthens the mainstream of the gender-based approach in some institutions, but at the same time, in many cases, has led to promote a more moderate sector of feminism aligned with neoliberal ideas that instrumentalizing and rinsing emancipatory demands is more willing to keep instead of challenging the neoliberal assumptions that create and support gender inequalities. In other words, using this new gender strategy, sponsored and supported by the neoliberal agenda, the IMF can appropriate the notion of gender and eliminate any radical and emancipatory ideas of feminist movements to promote public services. Something similar can be said as to the gender-based approach of the World Bank, that silencing the differential effects of the reform packages, destructive project that they finance, the private health system they promote, among other economic and androcentric economic policies. Before I finish, if time allows, Christina, I would like to make one last point related to the question I posed with my co-editor Mariana in our introduction on whether feminist sovereign debt, a sovereign feminist debt, is an utopia or an oxymoron. The type of sovereign debt aimed by the emancipatory feminist approach is based on a notion of sustainability that international finances as operate nowadays could not resist. Really, the spread of creditors sacrificed in the altar of the financing of economic and social rights, gender equality, and environmental sustainability. For that reason, the simple idea of suggesting that human rights should be part of the impact assessment of public debt and economic reforms implies assuming a feminist stand that is not indulgent with the basis on which the modern economic system is built. An unmoderated feminism will ask, which source of international law or constitutional provision sets forth that there exist imperative and discretionary public expenditures, and among the imperative ones, the repayment of financial obligation is found, and among the discretionary expenditure, health, education, and care expenses are found. So this basic legal question that suggests the transformative potential of human rights in the field of economy is not often reflected in the meaning of public debates around fiscal policy and gender equality, and this should change. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan Pablo, and for sticking marvelously to time. That's been really useful to get a bit of a sense of your motivation and kind of analytical framework for the book. I'd now like to invite Dorothy Estrada-Tanck to the floor. Thanks.
Thank you so much to Cristina Lascaridis, to the Open University, for this opportunity. It's truly an honor, and this is not just something that I know people traditionally say it at the beginning of an intervention, but I feel truly honored to be sharing the floor with Diane Elson, with Juan Pablo, Marina. It's really, I mean, I've read Professor Elson, and to be in a panel today is really wonderful. And I really thank especially Juan Pablo for having invited me to the book project, and also for the opportunity to share with you some ideas. Muchas gracias, Juan Pablo. To frame my intervention, which is related to the work that the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls has done in this area, I'd like to explain a bit what is that the working group does, what are its main functions, precisely trying to link with what Juan Pablo was describing before, was analyzing before, in terms of international human rights law as a tool to address the questions, particularly the questions he was posing at the end, and how we could use, which is what we are proposing, human rights norms and standards to challenge the global financial architecture and to reaffirm and make visible the obligations of states and other stakeholders in terms of challenging that system and constructing an alternative one from a feminist and a human rights-based approach. So the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls is a human rights special procedure within the UN system, similar to the one Juan Pablo used to hold as independent expert on foreign debt and human rights, that was created in 2010, and that together with the CEDAW committee, the treaty body supervising compliance with the UN Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and with the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, forms the triangle or the three-leg system, if you wish, dedicated specifically to human rights of women and girls. So this mandate was created in 2010, and we carry out three main functions: communications to governments when we receive credible evidence that human rights violations are taking place, be it at the individual level against specific women and girls, but also through laws or measures, for instance, austerity measures concerning economic and social policy, which may be violating gender equality or specific human rights of women and girls, such as education, right to water, right to housing. Secondly, apart from communications, we carry out country visits where we document in a much closer and more direct way what is happening on the ground, including in the area that we are speaking about now, including in as to the disproportionate effect of debt on women and girls. And so just to give a bit more of context, this year we made a country visit to Malta, to Mauritania, and also to Afghanistan to document the situation of women and girls there, possibly one of the most extreme ones concerning institutionalized forms of gender-based discrimination. Thirdly, we also carry out annual thematic reports, and this is the one that was dedicated this year to gendered inequalities of poverty, feminist and human rights-based approaches, where we make recommendations to states based on their human rights obligations. So this is part of an effort of different actors in the human rights scenario that are picking up and that have learned a lot from feminist political economists and other sources, and that are really trying to bring the human rights instruments into this conversation. As part of the communications procedure, one of the three functions that I mentioned, we also participated in the letter that Juan Pablo mentioned to the IMF, challenging that gender strategy as truly preoccupied with human rights of women and girls, particularly those that are in the most vulnerable situations or in situations of extreme poverty. But we also wanted, through the report of this year, to present alternative models to pick up from what many organizations and academics and activists are doing in terms of proposing precisely alternative feminist models that are also linking and building synergies with the movement for climate justice, tax justice, and precisely debt justice. So in the report, which is not only focused on debt, this is one of its elements, but it's really looking at the cross-cutting features between gender inequality and socioeconomic inequality, and the disproportionate and particular impacts of poverty and inequality on women and girls in issues, as was mentioned by Professor Diane Elson, of unpaid care work, of the unjust distribution of roles of care, domestic work, and proposing how these roles are should be reconsidered, and how there should be a redistribution, a reevaluation of them, including through restructuring of macroeconomic institutions and policies. So the report, and I'll post the link on the in the chat, deals with those broad issues, but I would like to read 3 of its main recommendations that are more closely, I think, related to the topic of today. These recommendations are directed to states, and they were presented both at the Human Rights Council and at the General Assembly, not only in their actions as individual actors, but also states acting within international economic institutions, such as the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, UNCTAD as well, and all the different bodies that deal with macroeconomic policy and advice to states. And we also direct our recommendations to corporations, particularly transnational business corporations that are also bound, although more indirectly, by international human rights law. So firstly, we recommend to take measures for the just redistribution of wealth and resources and a shift away from excessive consumption, production, and extraction towards an equitable global trade order, tax and debt justice, corporate accountability, and the realization of the right to development with gender equality at the core. Second, to ensure the inclusive and meaningful participation of diverse groups of women and girls in implementing socioeconomic strategies to realize the right to be free from poverty and the right to substantive equality. And 3, given the rapidly approaching deadline for the achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and noting the slow progress, particularly on SDGs 1 on elimination of poverty, 5 on gender equality, and 10 also on reducing inequality within and between nations, to reiterate the centrality of women's and girls' human rights and gender equality to processes of poverty eradication and to reducing inequalities both within and between nations. So in our contribution to this book, we also build more specifically on the recommendations related to debt justice. But I did want to frame these recommendations in the broader context of the actions of the working group to exemplify and to illustrate how we are trying to impact the positions of states. And I have to say that this report was actually quite well received, surprisingly for us, because we are quite critical of the neoliberal capitalist model, but it really was received quite well by not only by low and middle income countries, but also by so-called developed countries. And we feel, and this is more of a perception that maybe we can discuss more in the question and answers part, that speaking of gender equality and placing it at the center changes the terms of the conversation. It obviously doesn't mean that states will shift in their position immediately, but we did feel that it could move the needle, possibly now in this historical moment, post-COVID, with a revaluation of the roles of care, of the essential roles of care in our society, more than before. And I'll give an example to that effect. In 2014, the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls presented a report on discrimination against women in social and economic life. And it was very contested. And states such as the US, for instance, said that there is no such thing as a human right to Social Security, for instance. Whereas today in 2023, we didn't have those type of challenges. Again, this doesn't mean obviously that states are automatically going to follow these recommendations, but we do feel there's a different environment and that we really need to build on this momentum, particularly because international human rights law bodies and even activists have sometimes been criticized precisely for not engaging in issues of macroeconomic policy, on focusing more on individual violations and not really on the structural forms of discrimination that enable these individual and collective violations. And I feel precisely with cases such as the work Juan Pablo did as independent expert and other human rights bodies, and what we are trying very hard to do now, that we can hopefully move the needle to that with engaging more and with bringing human rights law to the center. And for that, I would just like to end with 2 references of how I think this can be done. First, with the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, together with the CEDAW Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And there we find very specific obligations that maybe haven't been activated or triggered as much as we could to require change from our governments. And secondly, Article 28 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights actually asked already since 1948 for the creation of an equitable international order that facilitates and enables the realization of human rights. So we have this toolbox here that we feel can be used in the specific ways spelled out in the report to really bring this conversation of sovereign debt and feminism to actual transformative change. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Dorothy. That's really inspiring to hear some of the work that you're doing at that high policy level. Thank you very much. Next in line, we'll be inviting Marina to the floor. Marina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. First of all, thank you, Christina, for setting up this debate that is key today. I'd like also to thank you, Pablo and Mariana, for putting this project together, and also congratulations to the editors and to the writers. It was a pleasure to be in this project together with you, gathering views from civil society, academia, different bodies. So today my intervention will be focused on the book, on the chapter Death, Development, and Gender, which I wrote with Penelope Hawkins from UNCTAD. I used to work with her when we wrote this chapter. Here the standard views, just it's our views, now our institution views. And now, so a general introduction from our chapter and our point of view from this debate on gender and development is that we are very aware of, a huge literature that we know that how austerity disproportionately affect women during the financial crisis. And that is, and we wanted to look in our chapter, we wanted to look from a broader perspective from the debt cycle and how currently the multilateral system is failing not only developing countries, but especially women. And we see our point of view is from looking from the debt-led growth and to the specific roles women fulfill in our society and in our economy. So basically, we want to see not only the impacts during the austerity phases, but also during the debt acquisition phase that we saw. And from this analysis, we are proposing how to see from the lens of how to build a feminist agenda on development and debt. So our general framing of this debate is that as someone that has worked in UNCTAD and very interested in this heterodox debate on how we need to finance development, our point of departure is like the discussion from Raul Prebisch, which was the first UNCTAD Secretary General, and it's also a view shared today with many heterodox economists that for developing countries to develop, you need a combination of aid and trade because we need more resources for these countries to develop it, and domestic resources alone is not sufficient to development. But what we see today is completely the opposite. We see net financial transfers from developing countries to advanced economies, which is hindering development. And for countries as an attempt to grow at some point, we see many countries leading to a debt-led growth, which is resulting in a debt treadmill that, rising indebtedness in developing countries, increasing vulnerability. And during the accumulation phase, we see that we have the accumulation phase of debt. We see capital inflows. We see pressure in exchange rate. The domestic industry loses competitiveness. It means that countries, they has less ability to gain foreign liquidity for their own industry. They need to rely on debt, and it continues to fulfill this vicious cycle of more debt, and more debt servicing. At some point, countries find themselves in a crisis, usually because you have an external shock, it's not a domestic, And then we see a phase of austerity where women bear the brunt, as we already saw. So I will not repeat the numbers on the trends of indebtedness, which Pablo mentioned before. But what is concerning for us is that in the last 10, 20 years, the external debt has not only increased substantially, it has increased more than economic growth, government revenue, or exports. So we have a pressure on liquidity and solvency indicators. And just to put in perspective, as I said, of aid and trade and the multilateral system, we find ourselves in a situation where official development assistance, which should be, a key source of external lending liquidity for countries, are falling short. So just to a perspective, since 1970s, developed countries are promising to find the target of 0.7% of GNA to developing countries. We haven't seen this. We have more and more ODA being transferred domestically. And just to give a perspective, so in the last 20 years, the accumulated gap on ODA, which is the difference of what was promised and what was actually transferred, it's about 3.4 trillion, which represents about 70% of the debt stock increase of low and middle income countries. So countries are finding themselves in a way that they have to compensate, and they're compensating for a very expensive, which is private lending, right? Because we don't have multilateral developed banks providing the volume of concessional lending. We don't have official lending cheap enough, and of course we don't have access to trade. So this is the broad way. Now looking, I won't take much more time, but then we look specifically how this logic is complemented in the way of gender discrimination. So we look how women play the role in our society and economy, and specifically 3 ways. As citizens, it means like their basic right and access to social services. Women as caregivers, we know that women still are the main providers of social reproduction activities, including household unpaid labor. And also as employee, because we know that women, the employment pattern of women is often connected to the public sector and health and education services mostly. So how does it impact in the austerity and debt acquisition phase? So very shortly on women and citizens, we know when austerity hits, healthcare is the first part where you see expenditure cuts. We see staff, hospitals and social service and services understaffed. And we know, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, countries that were subject to structural adjustment programs, they have higher rates of maternal death relative to countries that didn't go through the program, which is very telling how we are dealing with austerity and how it impacts women. But also during the acquisition phase, we saw that in the last 10 years, there is a tendency that sovereign debt services is increasing much faster than health expenditure for developing countries. We see in these countries where health is competing with debt services, we have more cases of maternal mortality. So it's a matter of life and death indeed in developing countries. And also when we have countries competing expenditure in health instead of and channeling for that services, we see that governments tend to change the supply of health services from universal care to a user pay system and privatization. What does it mean? It means that women, which demand more services for the question of childbearing, they are going to be the ones having an increase in their own debt level to compensate the lack of social services. So this is women as citizens. Women as caregivers, we see that the lack, when we see the accumulation phase, we see that service burden is limiting the role of government as provider of social services, including childcare, female labor force, it means that women end up spending more and more time, unpaid time, fulfilling that role. And finally, women as employees, we know that in most developing countries, the public sector is the largest employer of women comparing with the private sector. And women are overrepresented in healthcare and education sector. It means that we know that about 70% of workers in the health sector is women, predominantly nurses and midwives. It means that if countries are not providing, are increasing the expenditure in education and the healthcare system, we have less chances of women being employed. So I think one of key messages of our chapter is that investment in public health benefit women doubly and double, right? Because they are the one receiving and they are the one actually employed. So just to summarize, I think from this perspective that we saw, what would be a feminist agenda on that and development? First, we need to change our approach to growth models in developing countries. So this reliance on debt, especially on private debt, is not sustainable. It's women are bearing the brunt in both phases of accumulation and austerity. We need a more collaborative model where we have more ODA, where we have preference trade for developing countries, where we have more access to concessional finance. And today there is a lot of discussion on multilateral development banks. I think it's key to recognize that multilateralism goes beyond lending from multilateral development banks. We need more aid and more trade. We also need a shift on that sustainability approach. We need a proper sustainability analysis that put women within government budget. And UNCTAD is doing an excellent job promoting a new framing of the sustainability framework, which is the SDFA, Sustainable Development Finance Assessment. This is a important step forward. And finally, we need an international financial architecture that allows countries to restructure their debt without creating an environment that is completely unbearable for women, where austerity is the main driver. We need a different approach to how to structure the debt. So this is our main message. So again, thank you very much, and looking forward for the discussion.
That's great. Thank you, Marina, for sharing your work and some of your views on the sort of structural dynamics driving this vicious cycle of indebtedness. So last but not least, our speaker, I want to welcome Patricia to the floor.
Thank you so much, Christina. I would also like to thank you for organizing this presentation and for inviting me to be part of this panel, but I also would like to thank, and I'm delighted to be part of this book, of this very important and timely book, writing this chapter along with my colleague Veronica Serafini. So thanks to Juan Pablo and Mariana as well for this, for the kind invitation. I'm going to address specifically the debt sustainability analysis that has been mentioned today. Our approach is that it's not the right one as it should be. We need to prioritize life before capital in this kind of instruments and methodologies. So first, I would like to give a brief overview of the context. It's a context for Latin America, but we can also apply it for the Global South in general. So we are in a context of crisis, of multiple crises, the health crisis that unfolded some years ago, but we are also in a food crisis and a climate crisis, an increase of poverty and inequalities, and a crisis of social reproduction and care. In addition, there is the debt as a problem, not as a solution, is now part of all the global economic policies agendas, and it is in some cases, some countries are already in default or in a debt crisis. Other countries are with serious debt problems, and forecasts reflect that debt will increase in the rest of the countries. So it is important to make a strong linkage and analysis on what are these situation impacts over women. In addition, as it has been mentioned, the debt landscape has changed. It's mainly about private bondholders, multilateral institutions as the IMF, but also other multilateral development banks, the regional banks as well. There is the domestic debt that has been an issue for the last 2 decades, but now it's on the table. And there are also other debts as contingent and hidden liabilities that has also an impact and are usually not part of the sustainability analysis in a comprehensive way. In addition, there is an increase of the burden of debt service payments for the Global South in general. We have a database that reflects that the debt service payments are higher than investment in education, investment in health, social protection, and climate. And in addition, there is a decrease of expenditures and an increase of non-progressive incomes. I would just like to briefly share with you some data. I hope you can see it, just to reflect how debt this is for Latin America and the Caribbean. We can see that debt is higher than it was 10 years ago, and you can see in the blue bars what was the debt stock to GDP in 2012, and you can see in the orange lines what is this same ratio for 2021. And you can see that for most countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, debt has really increased in the last years. And I would like also to show you this other chart where we can see the interest payments compared with tax incomes. And you can see in the gray bars what was the interest payments 10 years ago in 2012, and in the orange bars you can see what is the current payment now. Well, it's for 2021 that we have the data available, but we can see that how this interest burden in our budgets or compared to tax incomes has increased in the majority of countries. So more of the tax collection that our countries have are being aimed or designated to pay debt, to pay interest, the interest debt payments. So now addressing what is debt sustainability briefly in terms of what is the concept. The International Monetary Fund says that a debt can be considered sustainable if a country or if a government can comply with all its current and future payment obligations without any financial aid or debt restructuring or being in default. In addition, all the advice that international financial institutions provide are aimed to use frameworks and tools for debt management that prioritize capital flows. From our point of view, or from a feminist economics point of view, this is a contradiction because it is prioritizing capital over life. This to have goals of only economic performance, whose main concern is not what should be prioritized, that in our criteria is to maintain and reproduce life. So there is an ethical political issue with a clear purpose to favor mainly capital over life. And how these DSAs are, the debt sustainability assessments are what are the main criteria that they use for these DSAs? And it's basically to have an economic analysis of costs and risks of the debt portfolio, a very deep analysis of interest rates and maturities, volumes, but also it includes projections of incomes, of expenditures, of commodity prices, of currency exchanges, inflation, growth, and other key issues that are a part and where they end up to be assessed with androcentric indicators. And these indicators are mainly liquidity and solvency. The liquidity indicators would reflect if a country is able to repay that debt in the short term, but also it's important for the creditors and for the institutions that run these debt sustainability assessments to guarantee that the behavior of incomes and expenditures in the next 10 or ideally 20 years will have the guarantee, this country could guarantee that creditors will receive their payment. So it is mainly an approach that prioritizes the capacity of repaying this debt. In addition, it's important to mention that there is another role of the credit rating agencies in this kind of assessments that have mainly the same approach, favoring conditions to capital instead of life. As you see, among the key issues when we talk about debt sustainability analysis, besides what is the situation of debt, it is incomes and expenditures. And if the goal is to repay debt, but also to have a surplus, to guarantee a surplus trend in the middle and long term, so this is basically addressed in countries or by decreasing expenditures, which is the most common policy, or by increasing incomes, and mainly with non-progressive incomes. So in the first case of cutting expenditures, which is the most used policy, reflect that the main impact are all the austerity measures that several of our countries are living right now, especially in the South, and that has been mentioned already today in this panel. In addition to these tools as debt sustainability analysis, another way to put limits to debt is the fiscal rules, and fiscal rules are blind to women's rights and gender inequalities. What are fiscal rules are mainly long-lasting constraints on fiscal policies that aim to reflect from a country that there is a credible commitment to have a fiscal discipline. So it is a set of numerical limits on the budget in terms of limits to the public debt level, or in terms of deficit, or also could be in terms of growth or public expenditures. These fiscal rules have also gender bias, because, for instance, if the limit is, if the aim is to put a limit or a goal on the deficit, it addresses mainly only physical investment. That could include care, but human capital investment is considered in the national accounts as a current expense. It's not considered as an investment, despite we know that there could be higher return. In addition, despite women are considered as a mean for GDP growth, it is not considered the investment return of human capital and care in the GDP or in the tax system. Fiscal laws are not implemented from an income approach. Therefore, issues as basic human rights principles disappear. And we can say, for instance, progressivity or no discrimination, or use a maximum level of resources in certain investment items. So all this comes to the front line in terms of having objectives of austerity with a highly discriminatory impact. Our analysis and what we are when we wrote in this chapter is to propose a life sustainability approach instead of a debt sustainability. And life sustainability is understood as a historical process of social reproduction, a complex, dynamic, and multidimensional process of need fulfillment in continuous adaptation of individual identities and social relations. So with the incorporation of social reproduction in these approaches, in this structure, in these dynamics, it is a way to reshape the microeconomic and macroeconomic analysis. And this is also related with all the inputs that a DSA, a debt sustainability analysis, uses in their methodologies. With this approach, we also challenge that there is a difference, that first, economic policies are not neutral, but also that there are differences among women, many of which become inequalities when social class, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and nationality, among others, should be considered. Our main conclusions and also proposals from this chapter is that the sustainability of life is in risk under the current approach of debt sustainability. Both the debt sustainability analysis and fiscal rules contribute to policies that deepen the crisis of social reproduction and care, with direct impacts on women. Second, the GDP level needed for a sustainable debt does not benefit autonomy, empowerment, economic emancipation, and decent jobs for women. Third, as part of the DSAs as well, the tax systems remain with low collections of incomes and are sustained by indirect taxes, therefore don't contribute to debt sustainability nor to inequalities reduction, punishing mainly again to women. Our proposal is that we need a debt architecture reform, and also as part of the puzzle of the international financial architecture, we need a systemic transformation. And we need, in this case, a debt sustainability analysis that includes people and sustainability of life before capital. We need an alternative DSA that it's not only run and owned by the International Monetary Fund, as is in this case, and that is designed under global democratic frameworks, putting people and sustainability of life at the center. And we also propose that we need to question the role of the credit rating agencies that has also an impact in this kind of assessments, and that has, as I mentioned earlier, a direct impact as well on women. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia, for that contribution and for really focusing our minds on how life can be sustainable when debts are not. It's time to open it up to everybody in the room, to the floor for Q&A, for comments. I can see there are a lot of other contributors in the book that are in the audience, which is fantastic. Everyone is welcome to use the chat function or the raise hand function in MS Teams. And while people maybe gather their thoughts, I just wanted to also say that the contributions today have really drawn from the kind of different sections of the book. The book itself is organized in this sort of like general agenda setting section, sections that focus really on debt sustainability itself, a section that focuses on more international financial and monetary system issues overall. So it's been really nice to hear contributions that have drawn from all the different parts of the book. And that the book, at least in Spanish, is open access and it's available for open download. So if you were to be interested in going to the link that's been posted in the chat in Spanish, you can kind of click through and actually download the book directly from the publisher, which is amazingly generous in these times. So we have a question in the chat. Louise, I'll read it out if you're happy. I don't know if it's directed to anyone in particular. The question is, do you believe that the IMF can apply these changes, or do we need a new organization? I'm guessing it's directed to Patricia.
Okay, thanks, Louise, for that question. Well, our point of view, as I mentioned, is that we need an alternative, not only methodology and approach, but also an alternative, more institution in a multilateral approach that could lead this kind of methodologies, and also that has more participation from countries itself, because countries can actually do their own DSAs. They do have all the information. They could probably have more information to include, for instance, in these projections, what is the expenditure needed in terms of reducing gender and inequalities. And in the other hand, to have a different approach, not run only by the IMF, could also contribute more to involve other stakeholders in the countries to verify that projections are not over-optimistic, to also include other criteria and to be more transparent. So we think that it's not that it shouldn't be only the IMF. We are calling for an alternative methodology, but also outside the IMF. So that is my answer. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I don't know if there are any other people in the audience who would like to take the floor. Just to follow up from that point, one of the key concerns about the IMF's role is that it's not an impartial observer when it's conducting its DSAs. As a key lender in the arrangements, it's not a disinterested party. And given its role in not accepting debt restructuring of its own debts, it has a self-interest to impose, I guess, the financing of the financing gap, the meeting of the financing gap onto the debtor rather than itself or the private creditors. So this call for independence in these assessments is a critical aspect of needing an alternative. Louise, the floor is yours.
Thanks. That was a very interesting discussion. Thanks, everyone. And thanks for the great book. I have a couple of questions, I think. One of which is, Diane Elson in her intro mentioned the Bridgetown Initiative. And, it's obvious from the Bridgetown Initiative and other issues that the discussion of reform has gained ground and momentum, right? The IFI, International Governance Reform. Given the contested geopolitical landscape, discussions about the expansion of the BRICS grouping, etc. How do you see that impacting the prospects for change? Do you think that the current historical geopolitical landscape makes our struggles more likely to succeed or less likely to succeed? And then related to that, I wonder if you could think a bit about how the financialization of the global economy that's gained pace, within the past 30 years in particular, impacts these discussions, and what does that mean for us tactically and strategically, if anything? Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Luis, for your question. Before addressing your question, I just want to add to something that Cristina mentioned, that the book is open access in Spanish, and it's going to be also open access in English, thanks to the support of the Open Society Foundations jointly with Bretton Woods Project and the Frederick Ebert Stiftung. With Lina Lavina, we wrote a chapter on gender bonds, what they are, how they work, and the economic ideas that support this so-called gender bonds. And we actually critically analyze the limitation, the contradictions, and the problems of this type of new bonds that pose in theory, that theoretically tend to reduce gender inequality and promote women's rights through public policies and the project that are financed by investors. But at the end of the day are kind of another brick on the neoliberal wall. With a historical perspective, gender bonds, as the most recent invention of the financial capitalism, as they can place easily in the progression that started with the dismantling of the welfare state and the debt crisis in the 70s, and more recently, they are part of the process of assetization of the world, which tries to put a price and obtain financial gains from everything, including the demands of feminist movements. And we also put gender bonds under a microscope as to the contractual infrastructure, and we found that there is no actual incentive, neither in institutional investors nor in the states that issue the gender bonds to implement changes at the level of domestic policies to achieve higher social inclusion. At the end of the day, the gender label seems to be more a pinkwash strategy designed to attract investors interested in supporting or pretending that they are supporting good causes, but without much reflection or transformative action about the origin of gender structural inequalities and the policies mostly recommended by feminist scholars and civil society. And finally, similar to what happened with the PPPs, gender bonds carry a heavy political cultural cost because they consolidate the idea that interventions that tend to reduce gender inequalities are only legitimate if they generate at the same time financial returns. That states tend to reproduce this logic when they within their budget priorities, and they are part of this financial game. Yeah, but I'm gonna stop here.
Thanks, Juan Pablo. I can see a question that's directed, I think, to Dorothy. Are you happy to take that?
Sure. Thank you so much, Cristina. And it says, basically, she's happy with the report in terms of the criticism. Thank you, Alicia, to neoliberal system and the recognition that system-wide change is needed. And the question is how widespread this recognition was when creating the report, and were other organizations, especially financial institutions, be they the IMF or other IFIs, receptive to these views? Do you think this might signal a current approach that can be arguably seen as co-opting feminist outlooks in a piecemeal way that does not require systemic transformation? Or yeah, another type of approach to that. So first on the methodology for creating the report, with I think is important to see the nature of the recommendations as well. This is something I didn't mention at the beginning, but I think it's worth noting that as members of the human rights bodies, as well as other bodies such as the Commission on Development Policy, for instance, and others that work on these issues, but particularly human rights bodies are formed by people who are independent, meaning independent from the UN. We are not UN staff or paid by the UN, even though we uphold UN instruments and try to uphold UN values. So this is one point in terms of the independence of the background research concerning the systemic challenges, and then also of the recommendations. So we did a lot of academic research for this, but also, and this is the second point in our methodology, many consultations. And this is part of our everyday work, not only for this report, with women and girls themselves. In the 5 regions of the world that we all each one of us works with in our everyday jobs. And so this also allowed us to really pick up very specific challenges and lived experiences of women and girls. So this also gives, I think, these types of reports a legitimacy that other desk reports may not, right? That are not really in contact with the stakeholders themselves and the affected women and girls living in poverty themselves. So that was one point. And in that sense, I think it holds a power to persuade or to convince an authoritative force, hopefully to the IFIs, that will be that will be stronger, that will hold a stronger push than others. Still, we do not have an indication yet as to whether they will take them into account. We did have consultation with World Bank, IMF, and UNCTAD during the process of constructing the report. And maybe here, I don't know if Juan Pablo would like to add also from his experience on how to push them. Our challenge now, and I might invite all of you to an event, is really how to organize from the grassroots movements and with the interaction with states to comply with the recommendations because they are based on international law. That is the power that we also really want to potentialize and to activate. But it's an open question because, of course, we know that these are radical changes, that sometimes they take a lot of time. But we did want to put the different tools together in one same report that could help activists and civil society organizations and academics as well to frame their requests based on international human rights law. So this is really an open task for all of us, I think.
Thank you, Dorothy. I'm wondering if any of the other speakers would like to have a final word.
Okay, very quickly. I think we are seeing, like, from the IMF questions and alternative liquidity, I think we are seeing now options and the BRICS and, you know, swaps from China. But the question is to what extent they are going to substitute the IMF and all this austerity approach. I think it's an open question. But yeah, but final thoughts. Thank you very much for the invitation. I think it's a key question that we need to continue doing research and advocacy. And yeah, looking forward to contributing with you in the future.
Thank you, Marina. Diane?
It's been a great seminar. Thank you very much. I think, of course, we're all thinking about how can the situation be transformed? And there's no easy answer, but I do take heart from the multiple prongs that we're seeing in this discussion, the kind of technical analysis of what kind of more technical reforms in the international financial architecture would you need, dealing with the credit rating agencies, having alternatives to them, having capital controls that actually reduce the power of private international finance and that lead to countries having these fiscal rules because they're so afraid of the reactions in financial markets. But then I think also the links that people have made to the trade and the tax agenda. So you need action on all of these. But I also think a unique contribution of this book is the bringing of that together with a human rights agenda, which both appeals to international law and says there's more than one kind of law that's relevant to this issue, and that also brings ethics into the issue. There's the life sustainability versus the debt sustainability, and you need that kind of ethical approach, I think, as well, if you're going to have social mobilization around this transformation, so that you need contributions from these many people working on this. And I take that as an important contribution of the book and of this seminar we've been having. No easy answer. It's hard to know when we can see lots of cracks and breaks. What will actually bring about the transformation is always hard to know. But I think, as Dorothy used this phrase about moving the needle, I mean, that's all we can do from our different positions, is to try and move the needle in different places, fighting where we stand. But thank you all very much.
Okay, perfect. So I'm just going to draw the event to a close by congratulating Juan Pablo and Mariana for this undertaking. and for all the distinguished speakers who've joined to help amplify that work. I hope we'll have more opportunities to continue that amplification in the time to come. This recording will be on the website if any of you want to access it soon after. And just thanks again to everybody for joining us.
Great.
Thank you.
Christina.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.